Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Confucian?
Confucian tradition consists far more of actions and the preservation of proper relationships than on the expression of specific doctrines. The tradition so pervades Chinese and other Asian cultures that it is like the air one breathes, rather than a distinct set of beliefs. As a result, it is virtually impossible to tell who among Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans think of themselves as Confucians. There are still some people who identify themselves as disciples of the Master, but they are relatively few in number. Since so many rituals that Chinese and other East Asians perform are common to members of various religious traditions, the fact that an individual practiced ancestor veneration, for example, offers no clues in this regard. There are, however, a number of symbols connected with daily life originally associated with Confucius that still appear in popular arts of Asia. The so-called four treasures of the literary apartment, for example, include an ink stick, ink block, brush, and paper.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Confucian?
Confucian tradition consists far more of actions and the preservation of proper relationships than on the expression of specific doctrines. The tradition so pervades Chinese and other Asian cultures that it is like the air one breathes, rather than a distinct set of beliefs. As a result, it is virtually impossible to tell who among Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans think of themselves as Confucians. There are still some people who identify themselves as disciples of the Master, but they are relatively few in number. Since so many rituals that Chinese and other East Asians perform are common to members of various religious traditions, the fact that an individual practiced ancestor veneration, for example, offers no clues in this regard. There are, however, a number of symbols connected with daily life originally associated with Confucius that still appear in popular arts of Asia. The so-called four treasures of the literary apartment, for example, include an ink stick, ink block, brush, and paper.
What signs or symbols distinguish Confucian and CIT ritual specialists?
Even today, leaders of Confucian rituals are typically also government officials. When they function as ritual specialists, they don the garments once worn by representatives of the imperial household and administration. As for CIT, since there is no longer any official imperial religious worship, there are no longer CIT ritual specialists. Prior to 1911, however, CIT ritualists, from the emperor on down to the humblest assistant, simply wore the garments that signified their respective bureaucratic ranks and offices. In this case, the literati did double duty as custodians of both civil and religious ritual. For especially important events, officials wore various garments known generically as dragon robes, each decorated with emblems of the wearer's administrative rank. Imperial robes worn by the ruler during rituals were once festooned with an array of symbolic decorative motifs known collectively as the 12 ornaments, or symbols. Symbolizing heaven and its wisdom were the sun, shown with a three-legged raven inside its red disk, the blue or green moon surrounding a hair grinding, the elixir of immortality with mortar and pestle, and the constellations. Images of mountains symbolized earth and strength. Standing for all living things, the dragon symbolized resilience. The pheasant, culture and literary accomplishment. In images of bronze ritual vessels, celebrants saw filial devotion. In cereal grains, abundant harvest, in flame illumination, and in the water plant purity. Along with the mountains, the latter four also corresponded with the 5 elements. Finally, the fu, a geometric form meaning good fortune, and the axe referred respectively to the imperial prerogatives of judgment and punishment. When displayed together, the 12 were done in combinations of the 5 symbolic colors associated with the 5 directions. None but the emperor's ritual vestments could depict all 12 ornaments, since they constituted a symbolic summary of the whole cosmos.
What signs or symbols distinguish Confucian and CIT ritual specialists?
Even today, leaders of Confucian rituals are typically also government officials. When they function as ritual specialists, they don the garments once worn by representatives of the imperial household and administration. As for CIT, since there is no longer any official imperial religious worship, there are no longer CIT ritual specialists. Prior to 1911, however, CIT ritualists, from the emperor on down to the humblest assistant, simply wore the garments that signified their respective bureaucratic ranks and offices. In this case, the literati did double duty as custodians of both civil and religious ritual. For especially important events, officials wore various garments known generically as dragon robes, each decorated with emblems of the wearer's administrative rank. Imperial robes worn by the ruler during rituals were once festooned with an array of symbolic decorative motifs known collectively as the 12 ornaments, or symbols. Symbolizing heaven and its wisdom were the sun, shown with a three-legged raven inside its red disk, the blue or green moon surrounding a hair grinding, the elixir of immortality with mortar and pestle, and the constellations. . Images of mountains symbolized earth and strength. Standing for all living things, the dragon symbolized resilience. The pheasant, culture and literary accomplishment. In images of bronze ritual vessels, celebrants saw filial devotion. In cereal grains, abundant harvest, in flame illumination, and in the water plant purity. Along with the mountains, the latter four also corresponded with the five elements. Finally, the fu, a geometric form meaning good fortune, and the axe, referred respectively to the imperial prerogatives of judgment and punishment. When displayed together, the 12 were done in combinations. Of the 5 symbolic colors associated with the 5 directions, none but the emperor's ritual vestments could depict all 12 ornaments. Since they constituted a symbolic summary of the whole cosmos.
What is the basic Confucian concept of appropriate moral leadership?
Confucius believed that order was essential for bringing out the best in human beings. He and his disciples rejected the early deist notions that all things work for the best if only people learn the ways of nature and that there is no need for government or military force or oppressive laws. In Confucius' view, government was essential, and that almost always required bureaucratic structures. But he believed the external trappings had to be supported by a foundation of example rather than coercion. No one can bring about the good society by force of will. One can only foster appropriate government by creating an environment of propriety, reciprocity, and good music. Yes, good music. Law, he believed, can erode moral values because people often prefer to act a certain way merely to escape punishment. The example of a great leader is preferable, for it instills a sense of healthy shame that leads people to seek improvement. Confucius was a realist, however, and conceded that law was often a practical necessity. What he wanted for the people most of all was the sense of confidence that can grow when people feel prosperous and educated. A good leader knows how to bring out the best in his people and how to wield authority deftly. But as a concession to the vast differences among human beings, government needs levels of power. Some can lead. Some can support a leader, some can follow but may not understand why they ought to do so. A leader knows how to cultivate conditions conducive to the betterment of society by tapping the roots of human resources rather than waiting until the plant is fully grown and incapable of nurturance.
Do Confucians believe in an afterlife?
Confucius did not focus on life after death as though it were the ultimate standard against which to measure the success of a life on earth. With the majority of his fellow Chinese, the teacher shared the conviction that biological death did not signal a definitive end to life. Death did not mean annihilation and loss in some great void beyond the grave. Confucius clearly believed in some form of spiritual survival, and in the ongoing presence of those who have departed this life. Hence the importance of ancestor veneration. but like the Buddha, Confucius and his disciples chose not to speculate about possible celestial or infernal post-mortem scenarios. Daoism and CCT would offer ample options in that regard. He neither denied nor affirmed any particular views. Confucius was convinced that human beings understood far too little of life. Here and now to wasted planning for a hereafter they understood even less. When classical Confucian sources talk about heaven, therefore, they do not have in mind anything like a realm of eternal reward for those who die in a state of righteousness. Heaven is merely a name for the highest spiritual presence of which human beings are aware.
What is Neo-Confucianism?
During the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE, Confucian tradition underwent a kind of renaissance. Buddhism and Daoism had both developed into powerful influences at all levels of Chinese life and culture. A host of talented Confucian scholars reinterpreted their tradition in light of and in dialogue with Buddhist and Daoist concepts. 3 10th and 11th century scholars pioneered what has come to be known in China as learning of principle. Li Shui, and beyond Asia as Neo-Confucianism. Sun Fu, 922-1057, Shikia, 1005-45, and Hu Yuan, 933-1059, transformed and revitalized the Confucian curriculum, thus paving the way for later teachers in their movement. Zhou Dunyi, 1017-73, continued the dramatic changes by developing Li as a spiritual or metaphysical principle rather than as simply a term for propriety in relationships and ritual. He and his successors expanded Confucian teaching into a full-scale cosmological system. Zhu Xi, 1130-1200, is the Thomas Aquinas of the school in the sense that he synthesized the teachings of his predecessors into his own carefully coordinated system. Zhu Xi became a sort of lightning rod for subsequent generations of scholars, all of whom had to account for his pioneering thought one way or another.
Have women exercised leadership among Daoists?
One of the most famous libationers was a woman named Wei Huakun, 251-334 CE. Her rank as libationer apparently indicates that she originally belonged to the Celestial Masters school. Some regard her as a foundational figure in the Shangqing sect. She is perhaps most famous for having appeared posthumously on many nights over a 6-year period to reveal to a certain Yang Shi the sacred texts of the Shangqing sect. Those texts consist mainly of liturgical ritual. Throughout its long history, the Celestial Masters school has allowed women into the lower rungs of its ritual hierarchy, up to but not including that of Celestial Master itself. Another school, called Pure Rarity, Qingwei, is said to have been founded by a woman named Zhou Shu in the early 10th century. Centered around a thunder deity, the sect blended elements from the Lingbao, Shangqing, and Celestial Masters schools. There have been many priestesses over the centuries, and a celibate community of women maintain a temple in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. Hagiographical sources are extant on a number of holy women of ancient times. They make it clear that women who preferred to pursue the spiritual life rather than devote themselves to family risked almost certain disapproval. Even so, it seems that some women were associated with religious orders. Sun Buletin er, 1119–1182, and her husband were both ritual specialists in the Perfect Realization Order. And she founded a new division of the school dedicated to the religious education of women. A selection of her writings in translation is available in Thomas Cleary's Immortal Sisters. Secret Teachings of Taoist Women. A sect associated especially with the red turbans is popularly called San Nai, Three Ladies. Evidently so named to honor a trio of priestesses about whom little else is known. As has often been the case in other religious traditions, many Chinese women have found possibilities for active leadership and ministry more often outside the institutional structures than within.
What is the Forbidden City?
A sprawling complex of over half a mile square in the heart of Beijing has been known for centuries as the Forbidden City. Some 1,400 royal rooms, all in single-story buildings, cover 180 acres. Yang Li, 1403–1424 CE, third emperor of the Ming dynasty, 1368–1644. Founded the Forbidden City as his seat of government when he moved his capital from Nanjing to Beijing. From this heart of imperial Beijing radiates a network of sacred sites toward the four directions. Aligned along the city's main north-south axis are the principal residential and ritual structures. The palaces of the inner court to the north and the halls of public ceremony forming the outer court further south. To the east and west are the dozens of subordinate residential and administrative buildings. In a massive plaza before the southernmost ritual space, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. An artificial river runs east to west. 5 small bridges, symbolizing the 5 Confucian virtues, span it. In the various halls along the main axis all the great rituals celebrating the empire took place. In overall symbolism, the Forbidden City reproduced on earth the court from which the heavenly emperor, Shangdi, ruled the universe. Beijing was the last of a series of walled royal capitals. Beginning as far back as 1700 BCE, cities such as Anyang, Chang'an, and Hangzhou all had their sacred centers. Beijing saw the abdication of its last emperor in 1912.
Is there a central teaching authority for Taoists?
Individual Daoist sects, orders, and schools have regarded and in some cases still do regard their teaching office as a solemn and demanding role. But on the whole, Daoists do not think of themselves as following any particular teaching or adhering to a particular orthodoxy. Even when important patriarchs, such as the living leader of the Celestial Masters School, have delivered formal pronouncements, relatively few Daoists take notice. What is true of Daoism in this respect is even truer of the much more amorphous ECT. In neither case is any specific articulation of doctrine of any particular importance. Doctrinal standards are replaced here by pure tradition - the way we've always done things.
What were the accomplishments of the Ming dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming dynasty. 1368 to 1644 CE, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a brilliant flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself meaning bright or brilliant. It was architects working during this period who produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people. In 1644, the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912.
What are some of the main varieties of Daoist officials or specialists?
Since about the 4th century CE, religious specialists called Daoshi, masters of the Dao, have led Daoist communities at prayer. These leaders can be celibate monks. There are also nuns called Daogu, who live almost exclusively in monastic communities. Monastic priests, mostly members of the Complete Realization Order, occasionally perform public rituals. But, not unlike cloistered monks in some other traditions, their principal focus is on their more private spiritual pursuits. Some ritual specialists are married family men who live near a monastery. These so-called lay masters, Qigong, make up the majority of Daoist ritual specialists. Individuals generally specialize in certain types of ritual, such as exorcism and faith healing. Among the non-monastic, those ritualists whose functions most closely resemble those of priests in various other traditions are called the Black Hats. Many of them belong to the Celestial Masters School, perhaps the oldest of all Daoist organizations. in addition to the black hats, the official and intricately trained priests. There are the red turbans known as fashi, specialists in the occult. Black hats, so called because of their small mandarin cap with a gold knob on top, are authorized to perform both the greater festivals and the more ordinary ceremonies to which the red turbans are restricted. The two groups are alternatively known as blackheads and redheads. Specialists of earlier times called libationers in the Celestial Masters' School had the triple duty of religious instruction, local administration, and ritual leadership. Not unlike the typical parish pastor in many Christian denominations.
Is there a system of deist religious law?
Apart from the charters or disciplinary codes of deist organizations such as monastic orders, there is no such thing as formal deist religious law. The very idea goes against the grain of the concept of natural balance and harmony that is so central to deist thought. That is not to say that there aren't countless standard practices and expectations as to behavior. The difference between Daoism and, say, Islam or Christianity, in this respect is that the Muslim and Christian traditions have systematically codified those expectations while the deist has not. Every cultural and religious system has its standards and sanctions. But in the cases of both Islam and Christianity, independent legal systems became necessary largely because the religious traditions expanded into new cultural settings very different from those in which the traditions arose. In the case of Daoism, religion and culture have been much more closely and consistently identified, making a separate system of religious law largely unnecessary.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Confucian?
Confucian tradition consists far more of actions and the preservation of proper relationships than on the expression of specific doctrines. The tradition so pervades Chinese and other Asian cultures that it is like the air one breathes, rather than a distinct set of beliefs. As a result, it is virtually impossible to tell who among Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans think of themselves as Confucians. There are still some people who identify themselves as disciples of the Master, but they are relatively few in number. Since so many rituals that Chinese and other East Asians perform are common to members of various religious traditions, the fact that an individual practiced ancestor veneration, for example, offers no clues in this regard. There are, however, a number of symbols connected with daily life originally associated with Confucius that still appear in popular arts of Asia. The so-called four treasures of the literary apartment, for example, include an ink stick, ink block, brush, and paper.
What other canonical texts are especially important in Confucian tradition?
A second collection called the Four Books, Su Shu, consists of very ancient texts eventually brought together during the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE. Most famous of the four is a work commonly called the Analects, Lun Yu, a compilation of Confucius sayings and dialogues edited by second-generation disciples around 400 BCE. The Great Learning, De Shui, is a chapter excerpted from the Classic of Rites. Singled out now as a separate book because of its centrality to Confucian thought. Dating to about 350 BCE, this work is probably the single most important statement of Confucian views on the cultivation of the ideal human being, or superior person, essential to a harmonious society. Another excerpt from the Classic of Rites is now regarded as a separate book called The Doctrine of the Mean. Zhonyang, traditionally attributed to Confucius' grandson Zhusu. Its theme is the harmonious development of human nature by means of right action, and the principle of reciprocity as manifest in the five fundamental relationships. Finally, the Mengzi includes the largely ethical and political teachings of Mengzi, c. 372 to 289 BCE, commonly known as Mencius. He was one of the foundational figures in the interpretation of the classic literati themes expounded by Confucius. The book's 7 sections emphasize the need for vigilance in cultivating virtue, with the ultimate goal of living in harmony with the will, or mandate, of heaven. By about 1200 CE, the complete literati canon of texts included not only the 5 classics and the 4 books, but 4 other works considered to contain the essentials of Confucian and literati views on all things under heaven.
Has Confucianism ever been intimately identified with specific political regimes?
Confucian teaching offers a great deal of reflection on the nature of an orderly society and methods of governing. It is therefore not surprising that a number of political regimes have chosen the Confucian system as their official ideology. Emperor Wu Di, r. 140-87 BCE, of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE 220 CE, was the first to do so, paving the way for a long and complex association between Confucian teaching and Chinese government. In Korea, Confucianism became the official religion of Korea by Decree of the Yi, 1392-1910, dynasty in 1392, to Buddhism's detriment. Leaders condemned Buddhism's view of this world as illusory and argued for the more humanistic approach of Confucian tradition. Perhaps the most far-reaching result was that education toppled from its elite pedestal and became available to a wide public. Confucianism took somewhat longer to forge its links to the Japanese imperial government. During the Tokugawa period, 1600 to 1868, after the capital had moved to Tokyo. Confucian tradition enjoyed its closest association with Japanese imperial rule. Particularly in the realm of international relations, the legacy of Confucian political thought stood out. Confucians played an important role in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which involved a restructuring of imperial administration. As the Japanese grew to regard Confucianism as an unwelcome import, the tradition's official influence in governmental circles diminished steadily.
Did Confucian tradition spread beyond China?
Confucian themes pervade the cultures of both Korea and Japan. Temples dedicated to Confucius have never been nearly as numerous in either country as Buddhist temples or Shinto shrines. For example, and today very few active ones remain. But the influence of the master is still discernible everywhere. Much of that influence is due to a long history of cultural and diplomatic relations between China and Korea. As early as the 7th century, Korean rulers welcomed Confucian thought as a master plan for political administration. Under the Koryo dynasty, 918-1392 CE, Confucianism took its place alongside of divination and Buddhism as the third in a triad of essential traditional teachings. Korean Confucianism reached its zenith during the long-lived Yi dynasty, 1392 to 1910. There was a time, Koreans occasionally point out, when even the Chinese confessed that their Korean neighbors had outdone them in devotion to Confucius. In Seoul, a Confucian university called Sungkyunkwan remains an important symbol of the tradition's impact on Korea. Confucian tradition came to Japan via Korea around 400 CE, a century and a half before Buddhism. Early Confucian scholars brought Chinese ideas to the Japanese imperial court, diffusing concepts that would go on to become an integral part of Japanese culture. Today the once elegant Confucian temple in downtown Tokyo has few visitors and is badly in need of repair. But Confucian ideals of family and social relationships are still part of the cultural air the Japanese people breathe.
How would you sum up the history of Confucianism?
During the first couple of centuries after the time of Confucius, two major thinkers developed the beginnings of what we now call Confucianism. Mencius, or Meng Zi, 371 to 289 BCE, and Sun Zi, d. 215 BCE, codified the teachings of the master into the foundations of a political philosophy. Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, 221 to 210 BCE, displeased with the emerging movement, tried to suppress it by burning all the Confucian texts. Before that emperor died, in 210 BCE, he had succeeded in transforming feudal China into a centralized bureaucracy, but Confucianism survived. Under the new Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, the state espoused Confucianism as its core ideology. Confucianism took institutional shape as a system for training the empire's bureaucrats and officials, thereby strengthening the cultural elite known as the literati. For the next several centuries, Confucianism's prestige dwindled as Buddhism's star rose with increasing imperial patronage. During the southern and northern, 265 to 581 CE, Sui, 581 to 618, and Tang dynasties, 618 to 906, Confucian ritual and literati authority held on, criticizing Buddhism as an insidious import and enjoying sporadic periods of notoriety. Confucianism returned to prominence during the Song dynasty. 960-1279, as a result of the Neo-Confucian revival. Scholars finalized the canon of the 5 classics and 4 books, plus several subsidiary works. Official Neo-Confucian philosophies drifted away from traditional beliefs in a transcendent divine heaven, emphasizing ethics and social responsibility. But a cult centered around Confucius survived. During the last of the Chinese dynasties, the Qing, or Manchu, 1644 to 1911. A generally strong literati class continued to promote an increasingly static and dogmatic form of Confucian orthodoxy. The last emperor fell with the arrival of Sun Yat-sen's new republic, and the literati became functionally obsolete. Still, the leaders of the republic held Confucius up as the epitome of Chinese culture. When Mao Zedong's communist movement began its rise in the 1930s, the chairman declared himself fed up with Confucius and the old ways. In response, the Republican nationalist movement insisted that Confucianism represented all genuinely Chinese values. As the nationalists fled the mainland and established themselves in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, overt acknowledgement of Confucian tradition went with them.
Is there such a thing as Confucian fundamentalism?
Confucian scholars have devised a wide range of methods for interpreting the classical sources. Many of the central concepts in Confucian thought are simply too large and subtle to interpret literally. Take the notion of the mandate of heaven, for example. Dynasties have come and gone frequently in China's long history, and many have interpreted dynastic decay as a sure indication that the emperor had lost his contact with heaven's will. That is an easy enough judgment to make in retrospect. But using the mandate theory as a criterion for deciding whether the people are justified in bringing down this regime now is a much more complicated matter. Some interpreters have chosen to apply the criteria of the classical sources directly to current events. They have their Christian counterparts, for example, in those who have discerned portents of the apocalypse in the world around them at various times in history. Some Confucian texts have lent themselves more readily to literal interpretation. So much so that their prescriptions have become the very fabric of life for countless Chinese who have never set foot in a Confucian temple. Those are books like the Religie, with its detailed descriptions of ritualized relationships across the full spectrum of human activity.
How can a man conceal his character?
Qi Kangzi asked how to cause the people to reverence their ruler, to be faithful to him, and to go on to nerve themselves to virtue. The master said, "Let him preside over them with gravity, then they will reverence to him. Let him be filial and kind to all, then they will be faithful to him. Let him advance the good and teach the incompetent, then they will eagerly seek to be virtuous."
Who is the Jade Emperor?
One of the more intriguing personalities in the Daoist and CCT pantheons is the Jade Emperor, Yu Huangdi. His emergence as a power to be reckoned with in popular worship offers important insight into the dynamics of Chinese religion generally. During the 5th and 6th centuries, Yu Huangdi was but one among many relatively minor deities. During the Tang dynasty of the 7th through 9th centuries, he gained prominence as a result of the appearance of a new text called the Jade Emperor Scripture, Yu Huangjing. It tells how centuries earlier a queen had dreamt that Taishang Daojun, second of the three pure ones, handed her an infant. She awoke and bore a child, who after a short time as a young prince, withdrew to mountain solitude. Lengthy spiritual discipline transformed the youth into the Jade Emperor. In the 10th century, a Song dynasty emperor named Zhenzong, r. 998-1022, chose Yu Huangdi as his patron deity and spread word of an expected revelation that came in 1008 in the form of sacred scriptures, thus bolstering the weak emperor's position. Thereafter the Jade Emperor rose to the top of the popular pantheon, thus becoming the CEO of a divine bureaucracy. Stories like that of the Jade Emperor help to explain why enumerations of the Daoist and CCT pantheons are sometimes a bit confusing.
Is there a distinctively Confucian ethic?
A Confucian formulation of the universal golden rule at first strikes the ear as rather negative and passive. Do not do to others what you do not want done to you. But the Confucian ethic turns out to be overwhelmingly active and positive, because of its emphasis on cultivating the natural human capacity for virtue. The master's positive approach revolves around several key concepts. First and foremost is Li, principle or propriety, consisting of a whole range of directives for human behavior. Much of Li arises from the customs that embody the spirit of community. When people can rely on propriety in all relationships, as enshrined in time-honored practice, they experience assurance and freedom in their relationships. Confucius gathered a huge catalogue of social rituals, not out of antiquarian curiosity, but as a way of preserving what he considered the best of tradition. Ritual propriety is not meant to confine, but to give a sense of lightness and freedom. Without Li, he thought, there can be no justice, no morality. For a society without propriety has no foundation in respect. Of equal importance is the notion of shu, reciprocity in interpersonal relationships. Reciprocity is essential to putting Li into action, for it governs the 5 principal human relationships and the 10 associated virtues. In the father-son relationship, the father must cultivate kindness, the son reverence. The elder brother must deal gently with his younger brother, who responds with respect. A mutuality of faithfulness and obedience should characterize husband-wife relationships. Let all elders be considerate of those younger, and expect deference in return. Finally, a ruler must strive to treat subjects with benevolence and benefit from their loyalty as a result.
Is there a distinctively Confucian interpretation of history?
Confucius refused to think of himself as an innovator. Any individual bent on inventing his own system of thought was doomed to failure. So interdependent are we humans. His task, he believed, was what he called the renewal of antiquity. His first step was to translate his knowledge of tradition into clearly articulated principles, so that he could intelligently sort out the best of the past. Confucius discerned in the drift of history a serious problem of societal entropy, the tendency to let things unravel. Looking back to the legendary founders of Chinese society, Confucius believed the first major problem set in when the Xia dynasty, 1994 to 1525 BCE, instituted the principle of hereditary succession. When decline in the quality of the rulers reached a disastrous low, the Shang dynasty, 1525 to 1028 BCE, overthrew the last Xia tyrant. Unfortunately, the Shang rulers retained the hereditary throne, thus virtually sealing their own eventual demise. Sure enough, the Zhou dynasty, 1028 to 222 BCE, was destined to be the instrument of renewal. By the master's own time, the Zhou, too, showed signs of serious decay. The master wondered what power under heaven might again correct the course of history. Confucius was convinced that it was possible to imitate the eternally true in history, to avoid reliving all of the past by distinguishing the good from the evil in it. True authority arose out of the ability to blend the ancient with the new. And only through learning could a leader assimilate the eternally true to changing needs. Beginning with politics and ethics, Confucius set out to contribute to the renewal of antiquity.
Who are the 8 immortals?
Three historical and 5 legendary persons believed to have achieved immortality figure prominently in Chinese religious lore. Daoist sources tell of many other mortals who have achieved immortality. But these 8 are especially important. Chinese religious lore contains many sets of 8 trigrams, precious objects, cosmic directions, for example. The immortals, Xian, are in some ways analogous to Christianity's saints and Islam's friends of God. Lu Dongbin, originally a patriarch of the Complete Realization School during the 8th century, generally leads the group. He usually dresses as a scholar and carries a fly whisk. Some images show him with his magical sword. One of the 8 Daoist emblems. Lu is patron of barbers and is celebrated for his healing powers. Li Taiguai, a purely legendary figure whose emblems are the gourd and crutch, appears as an old crippled beggar. He champions the weak and marginalized and is a patron of pharmacists. Zhang Guolao lived sometime between 650 and 750 CE. Capable of making himself invisible, Zhang appears riding, often backwards, on a white mule which he could roll up and tuck into his sleeve. His emblem is the percussion instrument made of a bamboo tube and 2 sticks, and he is the patron of elderly men. He Xiangu, the lone female of the group, holds a bamboo ladle, a lotus or basket of flowers, and sometimes the peach of immortality. She is said to have lived around 700 CE and is noted for her asceticism and kindness. Han Xiangzi is the patron of musicians. He carries a flute and is known for his spendthrift ways and delight in mountain solitude. Zhongli Chuan is supposed to have been a soldier of old who failed in battle and became an alchemist. Apparently once a historical figure. The aging and portly fellow eventually ascended to heaven on a stork and now carries a fan. Lan Cai is a strange figure among strange figures. With 1 foot bare and 1 shod, sometimes appearing as a woman, sometimes as a boy. He carries a basket of flowers and is patron of florists. Cao Guoju, patron of actors, carries a pair of castanets or, alternatively, a jade court tablet that was his entry pass and from which the image of castanets may have developed. Tradition makes this 8th immortal the brother of a Song dynasty empress and dresses him in royal finery. The whole octet are still widely popular and sought out for their magical powers.
What signs or symbols distinguish Confucian and CIT ritual specialists?
Even today, leaders of Confucian rituals are typically also government officials. When they function as ritual specialists, they don the garments once worn by representatives of the imperial household and administration. As for CIT, since there is no longer any official imperial religious worship, there are no longer CIT ritual specialists. Prior to 1911, however, CIT ritualists, from the emperor on down to the humblest assistant, simply wore the garments that signified their respective bureaucratic ranks and offices. In this case, the literati did double duty as custodians of both civil and religious ritual. For especially important events, officials wore various garments known generically as dragon robes, each decorated with emblems of the wearer's administrative rank. Imperial robes worn by the ruler during rituals were once festooned with an array of symbolic decorative motifs known collectively as the 12 ornaments, or symbols. Symbolizing heaven and its wisdom were the sun, shown with a three-legged raven inside its red disk, the blue or green moon surrounding a hair grinding, the elixir of immortality with mortar and pestle, and the constellations. Images of mountains symbolized earth and strength. Standing for all living things, the dragon symbolized resilience. The pheasant, culture and literary accomplishment. In images of bronze ritual vessels, celebrants saw filial devotion. In cereal grains, abundant harvest, in flame illumination, and in the water plant purity. Along with the mountains, the latter four also corresponded with the 5 elements. Finally, the fu, a geometric form meaning good fortune, and the axe, referred respectively to the imperial prerogatives of judgment and punishment. When displayed together, the 12 were done in combinations of the 5 symbolic colors associated with the 5 directions. None but the emperor's ritual vestments could depict all 12 ornaments, since they constituted a symbolic summary of the whole cosmos.
What is meant by the term rectification of names?
If Confucius were here today, he would surely be aghast at the way inflated language seems to have taken over ordinary conversation. I was so tired I was literally dead on my feet. No, you weren't, he might say. Drop the literally and your expression will have far more impact, even though your surrounding culture insists that more is better. He would be amazed to hear restaurant staff introduce themselves as your food and beverage counselor, or hear store cashiers and stockers identified as sales associates and inventory specialists. But Confucius would worry less about such trivial matters than about the very same deep social issues he agonized over in his own time. When a man fails to show respect to his parents, do not call him a son. If he fails to guide his children, he is unworthy to be called a father. If a woman does not attend to her family faithfully, one can hardly call her a wife or mother. If a man is unfaithful to his wife, do not call him a husband. Of greatest political import is his insistence that no unjust ruler deserves the name emperor. Beneath this apparently nitpicking criticism, Confucius was getting at a profound truth, over the long haul. Imprecise speech allows injustice to go unnoticed because it can be hidden behind acceptable names. Euphemism can erode one's sense of right and wrong and desensitize a person to violence. Eventually we persuade ourselves that misspeaking is not a lie, or that stealing is nothing more than the redistribution of wealth. Confucius believed that language matters because it not only reflects, but can even change, the way we think.
Are there deist hierarchical structures?
Since there are many different sects and schools, there are no official and universally acknowledged hierarchical structures that unite all deists. But there are de facto hierarchies, both religious, within individual deist organizations, and social, based on a broader kind of class consciousness. For example, in the Celestial Masters School, the living heavenly master functions as a sort of archbishop, overseeing the running of the school's temples in the region. Within the administration of the school, ranks are named after those of the imperial bureaucracy, such as libationer, recorder, and director of ceremonies. The Celestial Masters School has retained much of its ancient hierarchical structure today. In addition, each of the various monastic orders is internally structured according to authority and leadership roles, with the equivalent of an abbot at the head. Hierarchical structures have also been very much a part of the several short-lived attempts to create theocratic states, but their claims to authority were naturally limited. Within their everyday lives, most deists would likely be aware only of the functional hierarchy inherent in the more elaborate ritual celebrations. There, a high priest presides, while subordinate priests perform much of the ceremonial action and musical accompaniment. Other non-ordained assistants busy themselves with the overall mechanics of the ritual, keeping the action moving by making sure necessary supplies are plentiful and other practical matters are in order.
What is the principal Confucian virtue?
Behind all the other virtues, what makes a good Confucian tick is filial devotion or xiao. The Chinese term is composed of sun with old placed above it. Confucius taught that all other moral virtue, and indeed civilization itself, flows from filial devotion. As a bare minimum, one should do no harm to one's parents. Filial devotion culminates in doing one's family proud. Traditional texts go into great detail about how one ought to treat parents, summarizing ideal behavior in 5 duties: reverence always, joyful service, solicitude for ailing parents, sincere grief at a parent's death, and proper ritual veneration thereafter. Lack of filial devotion was a most serious offense. Individuals could be put to death for cursing their elders. Filial devotion was the very bedrock of social order, a fundamental acknowledgement of authority on the family level. without which there could be no exercise of authority in society at large. Chinese tradition regards society as built on the family. Sons and daughters do not go out into the world as they reach maturity. Rather than leaving the nest, they invest themselves in the family, knowing that their children will do the same. Only in that way can the foundations of society as a whole remain firm.
Who is Guandi and why is he so important?
Like the Jade Emperor, Guandi, also known as Guangong, claims a place in both Daoist and CCT pantheons. He has the additional distinction of ranking high in the upper echelons of the imperial cult, and through that channel connects with Confucian tradition as well. Guandi was originally a military man of the 3rd century, named Guan Yu, who was executed after enemies of the Han dynasty captured him in battle. The court funded temples in his honor and publicized his cause. Meanwhile, the newly deified Guandi was gaining popularity among practitioners of CCT as a refuge from problems as diverse as illness, bad weather, and failing business. The ever-ready all-purpose deity thus rose to such prominence that his popular cult situated him above even the Jade Emperor. In the 17th century, a Ming dynasty emperor conferred on Guandi the title of Grand Emperor. During the following regime, that of the Qing or Manchu, Guandi received the title under which he is perhaps most widely known, Military Emperor or Wu Di, thus making him the official guardian of the empire. Guandi's celebrity represents a relatively recent development. Unlike many of the older deities, whose imagery and entourage were typically patterned on those of the imperial bureaucracy, Guandi is reminiscent of the Buddhist bodhisattva. In fact, some scholars suggest Guandi also was absorbed into certain Buddhist groups after the 7th century. It seems likely that, as in the case of other indigenous Chinese deities, Guandi was first depicted under the general influence of Buddhism's use of sculpture. He appears as a very tall man with a very long beard and a red face, sometimes accompanied by his son. Variant versions of his story give somewhat different details. As in the popular classic Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, of which Guandi is the hero. Many popular theatrical presentations based on the novel have become a major vehicle for the spread of Guandi's popularity.
What is the human ideal in Confucianism?
Confucian teaching describes the epitome of the ideal society as the superior person, Junzi. That means an individual who arrives at a high level of personal development through self-discipline and inquiry. The superior person values justice more highly than profit, and prefers to be quiet and serene rather than vulgar and ungenial. Cultivating a dignified manner, the superior person nevertheless avoids arrogance. Such a person looks first to his or her personal shortcomings rather than blaming others for their lack of understanding or appreciation. It is said that the way of the superior person is a lengthy journey that begins from right here. 5 constant virtues characterize the superior person: self-respect, generosity, sincerity, responsibility, and openness to others. Expanding on the earlier teaching of Confucius, Meng Zhi taught that fully developed human life begins with 4 principles. Compassion leads to true humanity, shame leads to righteousness. Reverence and respect to propriety, and a sense of moral value to wisdom. Behind the notion of the superior person lies a deep-seated conviction of human potential for almost unlimited moral growth.
Do Daoists and practitioners of CCT run private religious schools for their children?
People born into Chinese families with a long history of associations with Daoism or CCT, or both, grow up hearing about traditional beliefs. They participate, practically from infancy, in family home, and perhaps also temple rituals, and almost certainly learn the ways of ancestor veneration. There has been no need, generally, for an educational network designed to preserve ancient beliefs and practices. Traditional values, some believe, are being steadily eroded by the increasing pace of change the world over. It may be that if time-honored Chinese ways of being religious are to survive well past the millennium, those vitally interested in that survival will have to develop more formal, deliberate ways of instilling the tradition. Movement in that direction may already have begun with the revival of Daoist seminaries in the People's Republic of China.
How are Daoist leaders chosen and given authority?
Traditional Daoist priesthood has long been a hereditary occupation, though that appears to be changing in recent times. This feature obviously applied consistently only to non-celibate branches of the priesthood. Individuals who successfully completed requisite initial training are ordained, following general patterns similar to those of Buddhist monastic practice. Ordination requires a quorum of ordained priests, and the ordinand takes refuge in the Dao, the canon of scripture, and the tradition's spiritual teachers. Much as the Buddhist monk takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Lay specialists, whether black hats or red turbans, apprentice to an authoritative master called a Daojang, perhaps the equivalent of high priest. His task is to lead novices through several levels of ritual assistantship. Students begin with basic musical accompaniment. Learn to watch over the incense burners, and lead group prayers. More difficult training includes learning to chant and memorizing often intricate rubrics. Ritual movements. After learning to copy sacred texts and write talismans calligraphically, aspirants are ready to lead ritual. In the People's Republic of China, some seminaries still provide formal doctrinal instruction. But that is generally not the case in Taiwan. Formal ordination focuses on the symbolism of the master conferring the seal of priesthood and the texts the specialist will follow. Some scholars suggest the training of black hats is more rigorous and literate than that of the red turbans, who tend to serve less official, more popular functions and have much in common with the shamans of old.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Confucian thinking?
Confucius was far more concerned about the present and its relation to the past than about possible but distant futures. He was keenly interested in offering people hope through the cultivation of a balanced society. Some have suggested that Confucius was very much a utopian, in that the society he sought to foster was destined to remain an unattainable ideal. In any case, Confucius did not envision any kind of inevitable cataclysm, an end of time at which the world of history would implode in a cosmic conflagration. Confucian thought has been intimately associated with the traditional Chinese reckoning of time. That includes cycles of 60 years, but those cycles do not carry apocalyptic implications. There have been millennialist and messianic movements in Chinese history, but none of importance has arisen out of Confucian or literati circles. However, some scholars detect in Confucian history elements that have a messianic tone. According to that view, Confucius himself may have fulfilled expectations of a messianic ruler nurtured as far back as the legendary Shang dynasty.
Where does academic regalia come from?
Early every student who graduates from high school or college makes a passing connection with Confucian tradition. Academic robes with their wide flowing sleeves are at least vaguely similar to those worn by Confucian ritual leaders even today in places like Taiwan and Korea when they celebrate the master's birthday or honor royal ancestors. But one look at the headgear and the viewer knows instantly where the so-called mortar board came from. Principal participants in important Confucian rituals sport large flat rectangular boards worn with flat sides, rather than corners, as in common graduation practice now, facing the wearer's front, back, and sides. Confucian mortar boards outdid modern ones in ornamentation, with rows of tassels all along the front and back edges.
Who is the Yellow Emperor?
Ancient Chinese lore tells of 5 August emperors whose reigns date back to before 2500 BCE. They are sometimes called culture heroes. In that tradition credits them with providing humankind with a host of skills and essential practical wisdom. As guardians of the 5 sacred mountains, the divine quintet ruled the cardinal directions and the center. Each was associated with a color, green with the east, red with the south, white with the west, black, or dark, with the north, and yellow with the center. By far the most famous and popular of them is Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, giver of such arts as medicine, agriculture, weaving, pottery, silkworm culture, and domestic architecture, to name only a few. Huangdi began his life in legend as a ruler and a shaman, whose magical powers allowed him to confront all manner of evil. Dated either 2697 to 2597 or 2674 to 2575 BCE, he was evidently a patron of the ancient Fangxi, or shamans. But the Yellow Emperor went on to become one of the 2 patrons of an early Daoist school called Huanglao. Perhaps a combination of the first names of Huangdi and Lao Zi. Huanglao Daoism may have begun as a religious movement as early as 3rd century BCE. In any case, though the figure of Lao Zi seems to have upstaged that of Huangdi for some centuries, the Yellow Emperor made a comeback in popularity. In any number of Daoist and popular temples a visitor may encounter a statue of Huangdi prominently displayed, perhaps in his own glass case. Standing erect, the sovereign, of solemn countenance, wears elaborately embroidered robes whose main color is, of course, yellow.
Were Confucians in conflict with their emperor?
In 213 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang accepted the recommendation of his prime minister, Li Si, that all books except the history books about Qin be burned. Li made this recommendation to strengthen Qin's authority, and to give him greater control over the scholarly class. All the books of lyrics and the writings of the various schools of thought were to be brought to governors of prefectures for burning, those who had these books and would not burn them within 30 days were to have their faces branded, then be sent to labor for 4 years on the Great Wall. Those who dared to talk about these books were to be executed. Those who quoted the past to criticize the present were to be killed together with their entire families. Those who knew of and did not report violations were to suffer the same punishment. The only books that were not to be burned, apart from histories of Qin, were books on medicine, divination, and tree planting. During the next year, 212 BCE, some Confucian scholars and magicians talked among themselves, accusing the emperor of being power-hungry, prone to kill and punish, and neglectful of intellectuals. When Qin Shi Huang learned of their dissent, he ordered a thorough investigation, during which the scholars blamed each other, rather than admitting to the criticisms. Finally, it was discovered that more than 460 scholars were involved. Qin Shi Huang ordered them all buried alive in the capital.